all disappear and let the evening commence.
Kia ora tātou. Well, this sounds beautiful, isn't it? Thank you all for coming. On behalf of Sir Graham, really. I know. He's the staff now. So.
That's absolute rubbish. Aren't I meant to be doing the introductions?
Well, you're meant to be interviewing me, so, you know, you just said it like a stone mower.
I was just shouting respect, Professor.
All right, mate. All is yours. What we're going to do... I can't stop talking.
That's his
I should shut up now. It's all yours.
He doesn't know how to shut up. Why am I here? I'm thinking about that myself, you know. Why am I here? It's not about me, actually, but it's about this gentleman here. Well, I was a school teacher. Well, he was in my classes. I don't know if I called it much. He was a student at Auckland Grammar School, probably between 1975 and 1980. And I was a young teacher of that school. I was just a couple of years ahead of him, actually. So I learned a lot as a young school teacher, and this gentleman and his mates taught me a lot. He was an above average student. His reports could do better. Very in-depth statement, of course. But he's also a very good sportsman. It's hard to believe. Well, I shouldn't be derogatory, but he was a very good cricketer. He was very technically correct. And he played in the same cricket team as a chap by the name of Martin Crowe. A guy named Martin Wakebatch, who both went on to play for New Zealand. And he played in a rugby team. Played in the first 15 in Grammar School in 1980, got injured. A bloke named Mark Adam took his place at halfback. And Mark Adam went on to play a lot of representative rugby for Auckland, mainly. So he was pretty talented. Until he found girls, I think. And then, well, we wasn't buddies, but I was his coach and teacher, and he was a hell of a good person to have in those teams and in the classroom. Several years later, we both became part of the Plunkett Foundation, which was the charity arm of the Plunkett Society. And Richie is the chair of the Plunkett Foundation, and we raise money for kids who have difficulty in poverty, and we're trying to enhance their life. Currently, we're working on a national lottery sold by the boys' schools of New Zealand. So we've been in that society for probably 6 to 8 years. We were just talking about it pre-meeting. I thought he was younger than me, and he would know the dates, but he said, probably about 8 years. So it's been a good association. And we've become very close mates now. Our families are close, we are close, and it's a good relationship. He enjoys red wine. And I'm addicted to it. So that helps. And we're still into sport. The Highlanders is beating the Crusaders. I know, I'm in Crusaders country. But that was pretty special the other day, so that put a big smile on his face. And we went to the last one-day cricket game at the University Oval in Dunedin, where New Zealand played Australia, which was a special day. And it was good to get together. But I must congratulate you. You know, we're in Tasman here, Nelson, and it's the provincial champions of New Zealand. I just can't understand why David Havili's not the captain of the All Blacks. He's a good player. But you've got a lot of good players, and it's just, yes, I just thought I'd connect with one of my loves. That's rugby, not rugby. Who I also love, who's my wife. Anyway, I'll get on with it. Professor Richie Poulton Yeah, exactly. Psychologist, and he's also the professor or director of the University of Otago Multidisciplinary Health and Development Research Unit, and he runs this Dunedin study, this longitudinal study, which started in 1972. He's been the professor of that study for 20 years.
21.
See what I mean? It's difficult, isn't it? Like 21 years, and that study is well known right around the world as one of the most intensive studies on children or people development, and it's used by people all around the world as a Bible about people development. And I've done a wee bit of homework on the plane coming down, which is a long trip. And this book here, The Origins of You, How Childhood Shaped Your Later Life. Right, so how does childhood shape our later life? And the questions I've got for them, from Professor Poulton here, Richie. Are humans more the product of nurture or nature?
You want me to answer that?
Well, I certainly think you could probably do a better job than me.
Very happy to give it a go. But before I do, can I just sort of set the tone? I want this to be informal. I'm an informal person. And so if when Ted is asking questions of me and I'm fumbling around with responses, you think you've got a better question, just yell it out. All right? Try and put me on the spot. Put the acid on. See how I handle it.
Or if you're talking shit.
I'll be very professorial in my, talking of stuff. So before addressing that rather small question of nature versus nurture, I just want to acknowledge Sean Hogan from my shop for the incredible work that he's done putting together and curating over a long period of time and multiple museum exhibitions what you see around you. It is a story of approximately 40 years. The study is now almost 50. But it tries to bring the science to life in a way that people, and I hope young people in particular, can relate to. And seeing it again, I first saw it at Toy 2, that's the Dunedin Museum, a number of years ago now. Seeing it again makes me feel very emotional and positive in emotion. I mean, it's beautifully laid out, albeit in not quite the same amount of space as it was in Dunedin. Very cleverly done, so thank you very much to the curators here for the care. So you've all probably heard of the nature versus nurture argument. It's been rattling along for a couple of thousand years. You can see philosophical musings by very smart people from a long time back. And then there's been the entry of science of some sort in the last 150 odd years. Figure out this big picture, almost timeless question. What is the answer? I did an essay in my third year at university in the 80s. Is it nature versus nurture? And I fell out on the nurture side. I remember thinking at the time, you can make just as good arguments if you're coming from the other angles as well. And therein lies the answer. Anyone want to have a crack? Or you want me to keep talking? It's both. Right. When I say that, people say that's exactly what they say. They say, how much percent is it nurture? Because how much percent? And then I glibly say, it's 100% of both. Listen to what I'm saying, it's both. Alright, it's both in different ways at different points in the life course. Depending on age, the environment. Environment is everything that is not genetic. That's how I think of the typical being environment. It starts in utero from conception. That's environment. The environment could be use of cannabis. It could be harsh or stimulating, warm, sensitive parenting. It could be what happens in the school ground. It could be what the rugby coach yells at you when you drop the ball. And it Here's the cynic in me. Because when you adopt a contrary position that deflects a little bit from the true science, which is this quite complex and interplay between the two, and you say, oh, it's all nature. All right, you'll sell a lot of books to people who have a predisposition to believing in that. Or the reverse. Prof. Last year wrote a book from the University of London, King's College, saying it's largely genes. I'm sorry, I've been around long enough. I've been doing this gig for 25 years. I know exactly what's going on. Truth is 100% of both. Both are important. There's a dynamism to that interaction, though, wherein lies the gold of truly understanding how, at an individual level, certain people may end up with certain outcomes versus others different outcomes. All right? Genetic environment interaction is complex. It's a bit of this, a bit of that, but also things that look like environmental influences can be a product of what they call gene-environment correlation. In other words, genes lead people to niche pick or select certain environments in which certain things, consistent with their underlying temperament or disposition, are magnified. Shy people tend not to go up to parties. Gregarious people do just that. Once you're a gregarious person, you go into parties, you have plenty of opportunities for being gregarious and having lots of human interactions. The reverse is if you're boogishness. You don't have much. So you have temperament underlying, intensified.
That's me.
I'm about that's not at all. Does that make sense, by the way?
Yeah.
Yes.
We have to interrupt because you'll talk all night and bore us to tears.
I love to study, you see. It's my professional love to study. And Ted's truly right. And, I need someone of this manner.
So if I was a young person and there was one single factor that I wanted to install in my young child for success later in life, what would that single factor be?
Pass the ball. Okay, so again, the sort of interaction. Who thinks they know the answer? Over here?
Self-control.
Bloody hell, spare me the punchline. So, the two fundamental causes or drivers of success in life used to be thought of as poverty or social economic advantage, two ends of the spectrum, and IQ, right? Sheer cognitive grunt, engine power up here. And as our very learned audience member has pointed out, that we, among others, have contributed to the international literature showing just how incredibly important this thing called self-control or self-regulation is for how people's lives turn out. And we did it with the Dunedin study in a way that was probably more rigorous than any other cohort in the world. Simply because we had so much information about the lives of our 1,000 participants, measured from the beginning of time through to their now in their 40s, late 40s in fact, that we were able to show that above and beyond the influence of poverty and above and beyond cognitive ability, that self-control, as we labelled it, but others called self-regulation, was the strong predictor of life success in multiple domains.
How do you measure it?
How do we measure self-control?
Marshmallow test.
That's one way. You would have heard of the marshmallow test, right? Kids came in and watch the video on the interweb. It's just hilarious, the original video. These kids were trying so hard, they were told to eat the marshmallow. Examiner went out in the room for 10 minutes, right? And the kids bite their nails and go under the table and squirm and stuff. And finally they grabbed the marshmallow and pulled it down. And they found in that original study by a guy called Walter Michel from California, the 60s and 70s, that those kids, when they were followed up many years later, those that resist for longer and some control over their impulses were doing better in life. And that led to a guy, James Heckman, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, to look at the data from the Head Start program, which is an initiative to help disadvantaged children in the 60s in America, and to see what outcomes those children had. They failed completely to do what they originally wanted to do, which is to change IQ. Completely screwed that up, nothing changed. But what they found was that the kids that went through that program, they were not engaging in delinquent behaviour in adolescence. They were not having babies at a young age. They were remaining connected to school. They were truants. And James Heckman theorised that maybe it was because that program had an impact upon the single self-control or emotion regulation. Now, basically, the notion is that you need to be in control of your emotions to be able to persist in the pursuit of goals. If your emotions are in charge of you, it's going to go to custard. Okay? So it's nothing esoteric. The items are, can sit still, pay attention, finish tasks. So we measured self-control in our study using multiple sources across 5 reporting periods, age 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. Multiple sources being the self at age 11, parents, teachers, and observations. So a really robust measure, multiple approaches across multiple time periods. You do it once, you do it one method, there's all sorts of error that can potentially be built into your measure. So
On the, apart from the marshmallow test, can you devise an educational program for preschool
Yes.
to enhance self-regulation, self-control? And if so, how do we do that, and how much is it going to cost, and why aren't we doing it now?
And can you burn it, or is it,
Exactly.
can it be influenced by something other than
Yes.
genetic predisposition?
Yes, so let's start with that. It's a very good question. So yes, thank goodness we can learn it. It's a skill. It's like playing the violin or playing footy or playing cricket, whatever. It's a skill that if you learn and then practice it a lot, you will get better at it. We all start with a certain innate level of this, but it's a bell curve. If you map the population, some have low levels naturally before they hit school. Some have medium high levels, and some have very high levels. What we found is that depending on where you sat, in the lowest quintile is the lowest 20% versus the next 20%, up to 100%, in childhood predicted whether you were in good physical health as an adult, whether you had good mental health as an adult, whether you had good relationships with peers as an adult, good intimate relationships, whether you had good parenting styles for your children, whether or not you were economically in good shape, whether or not you planned for the future financially, whether or not you were antisocial and gone to prison, whether or not you were dependent on benefits, social benefits. The list goes on and on and on. And most recently we showed that level of self-control in childhood will predict how fast you are biologically aging by the time you're 45.
So we can teach it.
So you can teach it. I know what works. I'm part of a consortium that is putting together a mixed program of language acquisition from 18 months on, starting at age 3, use of manipulated games kids like, which strengthen or highlight the self-control elements. It's called Engage. I've sold it to the Prime Minister, she loves it. There's some money coming out of government to support scaling up of this, and we've got a randomised control trial using this Best Start early childhood centres around the country to trial language by itself, engage the games by themselves, both together, which we hypothesise, believe will have the best benefit versus business as usual. This is how you do this right. You don't rush in because there's a hint or two in the literature, the scientific literature, this stuff should work. You set up a proper trial, and then you do it rigorously, and you don't overhype until you get data.
For those kids who are 3-year-old, and you were testing them, talking to them, could you tell who was going to go to prison 20 years later?
Okay, so this is a familiar chestnut, right? Is that James Blakey over there? So I like your view on this too, because you would have seen a few wayward children or young people come through your court over the years. Yes, I suppose we're partly responsible for that commonplace notion. let me give you a bit more of an in-depth but brief description of how antisocial behaviour, bad behaviour develops. There's two pathways. There's something that we've identified within the Dunedin study, and this is the dominant theory of crime in the world now, where you take children as early as age 3, you can identify neurocognitive difficulties that they've got, right? They're not processing the world quite the right way. You look at their family circumstances, a lot of challenge and difficulty in the family. There's probably a background of poverty. There's a whole bunch of factors that aren't propitious for life development coming together within these individuals, and that's about 5% of the population. And they are labelled or described as life course persistent. They start playing up when they're 3. They're the ones that are in the sandpit at preschool, belting the other kids to get the truck. If we still had milk money, who remembers milk money? Much of the audience think of this. They'd be nicking it when they were 7. They'd be doing a bit of amateur B&E by the time they're aged 11, you know, drinking the Fanta from the next door neighbour's fridge. By the time they're 13, they'll be converting cars, and by the time they're 16, they'll be doing some hideous crimes. Life, of course, persistent. It starts early, but the phenotype, expression of the antisocial tendency, changes with age. 5% of the population, but they account for 50% of the bad stuff, and it's the worst 50%. Right, that's one group. The second group, so you can tell that early. The second group are called adolescents limited. This is when 20% of the population during adolescent years will play out. And it's driven by social mimicry processes. In other words, there's a big boy at school who's the tough, who gets to do sort of adult things, smokes, drinks, takes drugs, has sex, all that sort of interesting stuff when you're a teenager. And most other kids look up to that person, and they have their high point really of life at that stage in terms of popularity and impact on those around them. So some people fall prey to that, become susceptible, and start playing up themselves. But they have no neurocognitive risk. They have none of that background of adversity. They are unremarkable compared to the rest of the population. Now, with two groups, quite different backgrounds, two different approaches are required. With a child that starts early, just talking to the child by themselves is not going to make a huge difference. You need to envelop the whole family, because that's part of the problem. All right, intervene with the group, with the farmer, and persist through time. A short-term intervention will not undo neurocognitive disadvantage, but a lot of wraparound through time consistently can turn these kids around. The earlier you start, the easier it is to change. The longer this gets ingrained, surprise, surprise, the harder it is to turn it back. Whereas the adolescents limited, you can probably figure this out, right? The last thing you want to do is throw them in jail where they're with other delinquent peers, where all they learn is, they get a PhD in bad stuff, all right? Because their process is driven by social comparison and modelling, social modelling. What you do, because they have no baggage in the sense of all that other adversity that life course persistent children have, you try and get them out of that system. And that's why you see in sentencing over the years in New Zealand has been a far more enlightened and humane and rational, empirical in other words, approach to dealing with those kids that are going a bit off the rails, but they don't have that long history. They look far more rehabilitatable, and so don't dip their toes in the system because that will drag them down. And so, among other things, that helped a bill that was taken to the US Supreme Court many years ago pass. It wasn't exclusively why it passed, but it was a bill to stop American judicial systems killing 17-year-olds. I mean, because they were too young, and you couldn't tell how these life course persistent, or they just, good kids are screwed up for a short period. Sadly, it just saved them a year because they carried on killing people from 18 onwards. So there's a bittersweet element to that particular story. But that's the thing about that chestnut farming. You can tell at age 3, yes you can. But nothing is, this is a really important point that's belaboured in this book. Nothing is set in stone.
But what about ADHD or fetal alcohol or, those illnesses, if you like, or genetic programs that are instilled before birth.
Okay, so good question. ADHD or fetal alcohol syndrome, they're quite different actually. So if you compromise a developing fetus's brain by poisoning it with alcohol, other drugs, bad nutrition, high levels of stress, cannabis, if you infect the child when at that critical point of development, you can have cause irreparable damage to the brain development, and that is very hard to turn around. ADHD, on the other hand, with vaccination each year, it's not a genetic disorder solely. So there's a bit of nature, sure, there's a bit of nurture. We did a study, and it's in the book as well, that showed that childhood ADHD doesn't predict the diagnosis of adult ADHD. Although there is some continuity in terms of if you've got childhood ADHD, you'll have challenges or symptoms of inattention and impulsivity, but it won't rise to the threshold of a clinical disorder. So that's another kind of issue in some ways, about continuity and change. But I think the general point remains that nothing's fixed or cast in stone, except if you have extreme trauma. And extreme trauma, I use in kind of a technical sense. It could be everything from being poisoned with alcohol in utero, or having your head bashed in the first year of life, or probably both, because those things don't occur randomly. Surprise, surprise. Okay, so it was originally the question about the age 3. I think I need to point out a weakness of this study as much as I love it. It's all researchers realise that they, at some point, I wish we had more information about what happened before age 3. Because it begs the question, we've got this ability to differentiate life trajectories now, but how did that come about? And of course we're a product of our own success in a way, because we didn't know that age 3 was an age at which you could even do that when it started. So we contributed to that knowledge. And new studies need to go back in time. And so I'm part of some work, international consortium that are trying to do just that. In particular, understand how can you tell if someone's having trouble with that self-control trait, which can be taught, you see. And we can observe certain behaviours that are indicative of trouble down the track, but we don't know yet what's in the black box here, what's in the brain, what might be a biomarker, as they say. So you can intervene more specifically in a targeted way with those children that are most vulnerable.
Richie, in the latest referendum on cannabis, marijuana, they should legalise it or not, or how did you vote?
I voted for it being a health issue, therefore to legalise. And the reason I voted that way was because I wrote a paper with some colleagues that reviewed the 30-odd papers we've done on cannabis and its consequences from the Dunedin study, and about 20 papers from the Christchurch longitudinal study. And what we tried to do, the paper was called, Lifetime, its natural history of cannabis use and its harmful consequences. A review to inform 2020 referendum. It was an attempt to make science more accessible to the population. It showed, in a nutshell, that most people use cannabis with impunity, no ill effects. 80% in our cohort had used cannabis by the time they were 30. Right, so it's normative to try cannabis. Most people do so without any negative consequences. That said, there is a group of concern that comprise about 5 to 10% of cannabis users, given 80% use. So it's almost 4 and 8% in effect, who start early and persist through time. Now by early I mean adolescence, mid-adolescence in particular. Why is that? Well, it's interesting. We know that the mid-adolescent brain is undergoing a huge amount of change in brain architecture. It's a highly sensitive point in brain development. So there's something about that point, 14, 15, where if you douse the brain with cannabis, probably other substances too, you're going to potentially rewire it in in a deleterious or bad way. And so the message from that paper was, overall, you've got a current system that treats it as a judicial issue, which is subject to racial bias and therefore inequity. Why not say that most people use it with impunity, no negative consequences. Some though have very bad consequences, and it's a health issue because the consequences are increased risk for psychosis, bad gums, loss of cognitive ability over time, a range of interpersonal and workplace issues. But it's confined largely to that group who stay really and keep going. He's getting a hell of a lot, probably a good time of cannabis is ingested. So, you know the usual camps, it's one or the other. It's either perfectly fine, no harm, or perfectly terrible, shocking. Both are wrong. What you saw was terrible distortion, of course, of the argument during the lead up to the referendum. My attempt to put some facts out there, I think, was slightly thwarted because I'm a chief science advisor to the government, several agencies, and also to the PM and her child poverty reduction portfolio. And those links essentially gagged me because I'm a public servant in that role. And for 3 months, like all other public services, you can't comment on publicly anything that relates to people's voting tendency. And so I had long discussions about my independence, but in the end decided it was wiser to keep my mouth shut. I still think it was the right decision, but what a shame others didn't pick up the cudgels to get this information out there because there was so much moronic chatter in those months. And a number of times I yelled at the TV at night. I can't count even.
We don't want you doing that. I read with interest that this is, the study's 50 years old next year.
Next year's at 50.
So everybody's 50. But some people, I read with very much interest because I'm maturing, that some people are younger or older than their chronological age. Does that make sense? What's that all about? On the study.
So, this is ironic that you're asking me this, Ted. So, did you see that program that Ted was on? What's it called again? Shape Up? Or?
Match Fit.
Match Fit. You saw Match Fit? Yeah. Alright. This could be a bloody setup, this question, because on Match Fit, all these old All Blacks had to get measured in terms of how fat they were and how fit they were and how biologically old they were. And I remember pretty good came out pretty bad shape. So he was 37, but he was biologically the equivalent of someone that was 50 years old or something, much older. Anyway, who remembers what he came out as? You got a friend there, Ted.
My wife is speaking with a younger man.
So he's 74, but he came out at 57. No, either of you lost some of the back. That's your high point. You go now.
Get back in training. So what is that?
All right. So we've actually led the world in this. I don't like to, show off too much, but these are what other people say. These are things that people have pointed to as kind of all leading from the study, and we can do it because the study members have given so much of themselves over such a long period of time. It's not because we're all Nobel Prize winners, we're the most brilliant people that will walk God's earth. We work hard and we have some clues, and we work well as a team with different skills. But this particular chestnut is, sort of the fountain of youth question, but it's a serious take on it. Now, the major threat to humanity, apart from climate change, probably, and viruses in the 21st century, is non-communicable diseases, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and a lot of research tries to understand the etiology of each disease separately. The most common and ubiquitous risk factor for ending up in trouble with some of these diseases is aging, per se. So we decided to go to the ageing process as a root cause of the development of all these diseases that are incredibly burdensome in the 21st century, and that the current health systems will be crushed by it. Current health systems won't cope with the burden that's coming down the pipe for the aging population. In so doing, we had an opportunity to take advantage of the fact that all our people are the same age, same chronological age, so a single year cohort, all in 1 year. And then we had measures that I'm proud to say I kickstarted the gathering of this biomedical information when I took over as director 20-something years ago. And we had measures of 19 biomarkers, measured at 26, age 26, 32, 38, and most recently at age 45. And we could track individual trajectories on things like cholesterol, blood pressure, glycated hemoglobin, measure of blood sugar, on lung function, on endocrine function, on liver function. Multiple physiological systems were able to measure all these 19 biomarkers. And our theory of aging, the aging process, that it's the gradual deterioration of multiple interrelated systems. So you would predict that if one system is struggling, another system might also be struggling, and so on. And we mapped this for the 1,000 people in the study. And what we showed was this incredible variation. By age 45, the person, they're all 45 like this. That's what's on the birth certificate, that's what they are. When asked, that's what they say they are. The oldest person is actually 2.4 years older every single year that have passed over 20. You do the math. The youngest was 0.4. So you've got more than a doubling of 20 years. So one person was 45 but 65, 70 biologically. Another person, the other extreme, was 45, maybe late 20s, biologically. So you just think of the implications of that. I mean, we've got a system, it's a one-size-fits-all system, right? At 65, we get the pension. Let's say I'm 45, but I'm actually 65. Ted doesn't get the pension yet. He's been ripping off the system for almost 10 years. He's still got a way to go.
The secret is lemon and honey in the morning. Cleanses the liver. I'm serious.
And red wine.
Fantastic. I'm 95. I don't think I look 95.
Richie, you're talking about those biological or those markers.
Yeah.
It makes me want to ask a question about the diversity of ethnicity and race in the study and how you think it plays out. I mean, I assume it's very tough then to project maybe onto other ethnicities or races, or
yes.
not?
A very good point. There's a question in there, but I think you made the point beautifully. So the Dunedin study is representative of the South Island of New Zealand in the early 70s. And if any of you can remember that far back, it was pretty white in New Zealand at their and so we are slightly underrepresented in terms of percentage of the population of Māori. We're very underrepresented in terms of Pacific families. And so we don't generalise to those groups. What we would love to be able to do that, but we just don't have sufficient people, sheer numbers. It's about 9% Māori. The national average was about 14%, and South Island was about 10%. So it's pretty similar to South Island. But what that means is about 90 people. Now, I'll take you back to the warrior gene fiasco. That was a shocking and shameful piece of science bullshit. It was done on basically a dinner party group of people, 20-odd people. And the author, who worked at the ESR at the time, nothing bad about the ESR at all, had no insightful conscience and basically extrapolated findings from a dinner table group to 2,000 years of migratory behaviour. Right, so that's the poster child of how not to do science. I'm very conservative about this because Māori deserve much better. So I think there are newer studies with much larger numbers of Māori and Pacifica and Asian New Zealanders that are relevant to ethnic differences or background, ethnic background and differences that they can bring. The irony, of course, of this is that one of the weaknesses within New Zealand of the study that we don't talk about is that it makes it very popular overseas for similar jurisdictions. So we've had many millions of dollars from the US over many years, from Britain for the last 20 years, from the US for 30 years, because they think, because they're so large, that if they can identify a series of pathways through life that they can intervene to make people's lives more positive, and do propitious and good things, if it applies just to mainly European people, that's still valuable. That said, there's a far more nuanced discussion around this issue. For example, if you smoke tobacco, whether or not your ethnicity is X or Y, is unlikely to have huge impact. It may have some on the negative effects on your lung function. Similarly, if you sexually abuse and beat viciously a child, that's going to have deleterious negative effects on whatever child, whatever your background. Where ethnicity becomes critically important, this is a higher rates of some of these things for certain ethnicities. It's not a fault of theirs, it's a fault of structural determinants that government is meant to try and address and improve. So any good scientist always recognises the limitations of their data set. There is no perfect data set. At the same time, you push your data with rigour as far as it can possibly go, with the hope and the aim of not becoming famous. I mean, that's tedious. And that's actually malfeasance in one way. It's about helping real people living real lives. Hence I took up this gig as a science advisor, because it was a chance to make sure that the science I believe matters got a chance to be heard.
What's the science advisor? What do you do?
So each ministry, major ministry, as well as some small agencies, have what is called a chief science advisor. So their job is, as a respected member of the science fraternity, is to bring science that's relevant to their particular ministry. So if it's Ministry of Health, you are there to collate, convey, explain what science says about particular issues. Fetal alcohol syndrome, what do you do about that? How do you intervene? What damage does it cause? ADHD, health again, mental health, and so on. If you're, so my role, I moved from Ministry of Social Development, which used to have Oranga Tamariki within it, to a small agency called the Social Wellbeing Agency, formerly the Social Investment Agency, because it's the only cross-sectoral mechanism that exists within government. And after doing this for 7 years, I realised that if you ever want to make progress, you cannot work in silos. You need to work cross-sectorally, cooperate. Much easier said than done. Wellington is littered with failed attempts to make this thing happen.
So with the self-regulation criteria that you've come up with in the study, and it's been supported around the world, how much traction are you getting with New Zealand government on that sort of stuff?
It always takes a while, I'm pleased to say that the boss is convinced. She's the only person I don't correct, because she calls it restraint. Yes, Prime Minister. She gets it and she loves it, and she's keen on seeing the work that is only now getting traction because of COVID. It was actually scheduled probably to get some money from the budget last year. I don't know that for sure, but that was hinted to me. But then COVID developed everything. And so there's an instructive point here. I didn't wait for government, nor did my colleagues. We just decided to design our own randomised control trial to get the right foundation on board to allow us to have access to their service and to get on with it. Governments react best when they have a high need and when there's something ready-made. Let's be realistic about this. You're naive if you think you can walk up there and say, say, look, I'm a card-carrying scientist, I know my stuff, and they're all going to say, oh, thank you, Richie, so much, just tell us what to do. That never happens. But if you can see where things are headed, you have a responsibility, if you have a bit of clout and cachet, to try and get the answers ready, so when the call comes, you can say, here it is, nicely done, rigorous. It's actually advantageous to do it that way, because government tends to, when they finally decide something, want to roll it out overnight, and they miss doing the right thing because of their enthusiasm for you know what votes within a 3-year cycle. So they want it done fast.
You can see why this man is one of the leading psychologists in the world on people development. The book is outstanding. He's outstanding. But I think, just to finish off, you'll probably want a piece of them. You want to explore that brain a bit more. And so let's have questions from the floor, if that's possible. But just if we can hear you, it's going to be the big challenge. So you're going to have to speak up. Yes, please.
I was just wondering, quite a lot has been written about the effects of children from the earthquakes in Christchurch. You were talking earlier of extreme trauma. Has this sort of impacted any thoughts on your study?
The question is about the effects of the earthquake in Christchurch on children.
So, good question. So I think of adversities as a class of environmental influences, and they can range from an earthquake, a natural disaster. They can include behind closed doors abuse of various sorts. They can include structural influences such as living in unsafe neighbourhoods, poor educational opportunities. The range is endless. And so what you would expect to see in an event like a natural disaster is two things: increase in symptoms, in this case initially psychological symptoms, and then what is called stress sensitization, which is kids, they may settle down, but they've been super sensitized to stress, and then at some point down the track in their life, when they have low levels of stress, they overreact because they've been sensitized to stress. So I would expect or predict from the way stress works, and everyone's different in terms of their genetic endowment, right, the nurture component. Some are resilient because of certain genes, others are not so. So there's individual differences in response. There's no perfect recipe across the board. Some will be far more sensitive to stress, and you might see a peak in the early adulthood of presenting symptoms, and particular psychological symptoms. Jury's a bit more out, so to speak, on physical well-being, but there's certainly plenty of reason to believe that psychological and social factors can get under the skin to cause physical damage, and we've done a number of studies showing exactly that as well. My concern, as well as for the children that went through the earthquakes, is for children that went through COVID last year. The background is very worrying, and so much in the last 10 years, you almost date it to 2010, we've seen an almost doubling of rates of psychological symptoms, anxiety and feeling sad and depressed around the world among teenagers. And you think, why is that? What's going on? And to be honest, we don't know right now. I'm involved in some studies that's going to try and find out, but what's changed in 10 years? Well, the social media world has changed considerably. There's a whole bunch of novel risk factors that may come into play, eco-anxiety.
There's a solution.
There will be solutions so we can identify what is the vulnerability and what's driving this. And it's urgent. It's absolutely urgent. Mental health difficulties are commonplace. It's normal in life, statistically, to have a period where you feel so anxious, so wound up, so stressed out, so sad that you'll meet diagnostic criteria. Alright? I don't have a clue why it's still stigmatized. 80% of our study members by the time they were 45 had met criteria for at least one disorder. Because we know that because we measured them through time. We weren't asking people to remember symptoms because people can't. Even when they're hospitalised. 25 years later, an Australian study showed that half the people couldn't even remember being hospitalised for depression. That was in the 70s when you had white coats and ambulances. A very traumatic event, right? So people's memories fell over. So the best way to study human beings, as is emphasised in this, at the front end, gives you the tools to understand, is to follow them through real time. And that's what we've done here. By the way, I should say that Ted's signing my book later on. What? So we'll work as
I think it's
so
But I was not the professor.
now we've got to identify what's driving this because it's a phenomenally strong effect. It's double. And so the way they've shown it is that you've got cohorts from this group, you equate them with cohorts from this, all the other risk variables, and then measure the mental health and some time difference solely that you attribute the differences to, and you get this in Norway. No, Denmark. Right, so we often think Scandinavian countries are kind of the exemplar. Doubling there. More than doubling here.
Yes, another question.
Hey Richie, nice to see you.
Yeah.
I told my granddaughter who's 14 about your study. I made it short. She had a question and she said, just by participating, did these people, their environment changes, did you take into effect the fact that just by putting them in the study, they may have changed their life?
Excellent question. 14.
Yeah,
You'll
sure.
go far. So this is something called the Hawthorne effect. It dates back to the 30s where commercial companies realised that if you put sensory experimenters into a factory setting, people's behaviour improves because they're being observed. Alright, so boiled down to our study, have we sensitised our group to health issues, for example, because we study these. And I've got two answers. One is a glib, showy answer, which is if it's as simple as enrolling people in a right student study, if they can do the right thing, I'll stop now, give me my Nobel Prize. No, of course it's not. We all know what the right thing to do is. We struggle sometimes to do it. And the real answer is empirical response, as you'd expect from any card-carrying scientist. What we did, we took advantage of, with our group of 26, the fact that they run a national health survey, and they packed in a national nutrition survey within that. And so they had self-report measures of health status on a one-off research naive group that were randomly sampled from the New Zealand population. Never been studied before, randomly improved. And they also had some direct physical measures, so stronger than just self-report, less contaminated by bias. Weight, for example, measured directly. And we compared the same measures that we obtained at the same time in our group against the research naive group. And they didn't look anywhere.
What?
They didn't look anywhere. In other words, there was no evidence that we had somehow changed the attitudes and behaviours in terms of these physical health indicators that were measured in both groups at that point. They also did something similar for asthma. There was research that showed very little difference between a one-off sample measured cross-sectionally in 20 and our group at age 21. So it doesn't seem that we made a big difference. People, though, I must add, are proud to be, most proud to be part of it. And we are real sticklers for confidentiality. So we will never talk about any individual. And I always interview people and say, if you ever do this knowingly, I'll fire, and I'll ask you to be fired on the spot. It's as serious as it gets. And for a long time, many adults in the study never identified themselves as being part of it, even to their spouse in some cases.
Okay.
But, like I say, we did a TV show about 4 or 5 years ago. What was it called? Why am I? Thank you. Geez, I'm getting old.
Why am I?
And people loved that. They enjoyed it and they felt proud as a result. And then they've told their employers and they've told their friends a lot more. So it's nice to see them enjoying their participation and feeling that we've worked hard to do justice to their gift to us. It's a internal responsibility we have just to work very hard to say thank you, and the best way to do that is to write good papers and then to try and get it translated into practice and policy.
How much do you share the data with people in the world? Like the raw data, or is it just crunched stuff that gets shared?
So we don't share the data willy-nilly.
No.
It's the only people that can have access to the data to use it to write scientific papers, and that's the only reason they would get hold of it, perhaps except for teaching purposes, are people that are vetted by myself and the associate director in terms of their bona fides. They have to then undergo a process where they show that their idea is a good one, it has public health benefit, that it's not already contracted for. So people can't swoop in and say, well, you've been collecting that data for 20 years, now I want to write a nice paper on it, when someone's been toiling away for 20 years, getting grant after grant to build that data set. That there's a supervising established player within the Adhd study to oversee and take responsibility for this new person's work, and that the data is strong enough to do a good test of the hypothesis. So they're not draconian. It's not draconian. It's amazing that the number of people that have come to me over 20-something years, before I was 5 years deputy director, so I was the last quarter of a century. So I want in, you've got all this lovely data, and you say, okay, this is a process to go through, it's not too burdensome, and most of them disappear. Some moan about it publicly and say, oh, they're a closed shop. Well, we're not. We have, it's all stated on our website how we operate, but we do this so at least I, at the end of the day, can vouch to the study members that I'm protecting their data and confidentiality and the integrity of the research.
On the issue of confidentiality, clearly there are some major criminal, bad behaviour that people have done that remains obviously confidential. Do you think in other countries that would ever have stayed out of the police or out of other people's areas?
So I'll just take you back to the Adhd 26 ethics proposal. The then chair was Nicola Pert, Professor of Law at the University of Otago, and she said, you realise that if you refuse to pass this information on, if subpoenaed, that you'll be in contempt of court? Yes. Okay, and you know that the logic suggests that you could be convicted and in theory you can go to jail. So I was a fresh-faced PhD graduate and I thought, how romantic to go to jail for this. Bring it on, and my more serious and wise colleagues said, go home and think about this, because I take it very seriously. So we all signed, three of us, the director, the social director, I as deputy director, saying that's exactly what we're prepared to do. The minute you relax, the study starts to unravel. Because the study members say to us, and I had a number of conversations with study members in between assessments for various reasons, and it's a standard refrain, and they say, I tell you stuff I've never told anyone. I haven't told my husband or my wife, no one knows, and I just trust you, and I think if I'm going to come, I'm able to tell you the truth. So I think sometimes our rates of certain types of behaviours or outcomes are a bit higher than the one-off surveys, and I just assume that's because we have this relationship built up over half a century now. We've had multiple opportunities to mess it up because we see them regularly. But we've worked very hard, we really care for these people. You don't get to work at your study unless you have an innate respect for what study members are given. And quality assurance processes and oversight are very thorough. And so we treat them like human beings. I mean, not a big ask really, is it? But some people have really hard lives, and they know when they come to the study for 1 day, 1.5 days, that they'll be appreciated, and and it's quite a different experience for them in their lives. So, how do we get 94% still participating after 45 years? It's because it's a golden rule. We won't do others as we like to do ourselves. Simple as that.
Richie, with the doubling of depression and anxiety, you mentioned social media. I think the evidence is pretty clear that with young people, the more they engage in it, the worse their mental health is in terms of depression and anxiety. And I wondered, you probably considered another variable, which is sort of fear of what's going to happen in the future, especially with the climate crisis. So I just wondered whether you consider that as a possible variable.
Yeah, it's one of about 25 novel variables we've tabulated. So it's what I mean by eco-anxiety. So it's about climate, fear of existential threat, essentially. So the thing about the social media findings is that they're not that clear. All right? And this is where you need to know your druthers. You need to know what's a good quality study. Because I'm often hearing, research is shown, and I hear this reflects how I read papers. I look at the method. If it's a rubbish method, I throw it away. I don't look at anything else. So don't believe that because a person says I'm a researcher and I've done research that it's actually proper research. This is why we took a bit of time in this book to explain that the art of doing good scientific research from this life course perspective, because it's critical. So I think there's enough in it to come back to the question that social media can have pernicious effects. There's the overall climate thing, there's a COVID thing now. I mean, who expects there to be another COVID? Maybe more lethal in 5 or 6 years. I mean, if you're not putting your hand up, then I think you may be, a bit trampled down by current circumstances, because if you look at the last, since 2002, it's been 9, 8, 7, we've got to wake up, and so the kids have picked up on this. The kids are really furious. Not just talking about the Scandinavian woman who is very articulate and has been mocked, a young girl. The kids in New Zealand, they went and protested, and they should be telling those responsible for leading us that there is widespread urgency. You'll have your different views on this. I respect that. There's a bunch of other things going on. Maybe that maternal stress is increasing across the board. We now know that maternal stress in youth, particularly in mid-pregnancy, has particularly strong impacts upon executive functioning in children. So stress hormones go across the placental barrier, and you've got a highly sensitive, rapidly developing brain. It's like you're putting in a potion, which is high stress hormone potion, instead of nice and calm, which is ideal.
What about AI?
Pardon?
What about AI and the move afoot to turn people into robots, make them think like robots, act like robots, and talk like robots? That's going to be a bad thing.
So that's a very interesting question. AI is something that's here, but we have a sense that it's coming. So it's both here and it's coming. It's just behind a lot of what we do in a day-to-day sense. We don't quite understand the extent of it. If you're a child, if you're a 15-year-old, and you get a sense that there's this kind of invisible world that's doing all sorts of things that presumably are helpful, but could also do a whole lot of bad stuff. You've got this imprecise, hard-to-see threat in a nebulous way sitting alongside stuff you can see, climate, social media. The social media things, I never quite understood until my daughter said, "Dad, look at this." And she showed me a feed, and every 2 or 3 seconds an ad came up. And I looked at the content of the ad, and they were all purveying this idea to be successful, you need to look this way and be this sort of person with these sorts of jewels or these sorts of activities. And I said, you're just drowning in it, right? Being told it all the time. This is your Facebook. Where's the privacy? I said, you can't get it. We can do certain things that are complex to try and head off this stuff. So these kids have spent so much time on these devices, they are having the their adolescence and innocence during adolescence severely compromised by uninvited intrusion by entities whose probably main aim was to make money at the end of the day. So issues of privacy in this modern world, of course, arise more broadly. Now, how does a child who went out on the tubes and did something a bit silly last weekend, when I say a child, a 16-year-old, feel when they see the video going around, both their social media, but also most kids are savvy enough to know that employers in the future may just do a search. Now, we never had that threat or that challenge or that burden. We just, only the people at the party knew what we got up to. And you know, it's a very challenging world to be living in. And young people, of course, have not developed cognitively to the point where they can be mature and wise and phlegmatic, or figure out ways of coping that are always going to work for them. That's part of what life is, learning those skills. So I'm very sympathetic to young people, and I've watched my daughter deal with the challenges, and that's made me even more sensitive and sympathetic.
We just have the last question at the back there.
I want to ask a question about happiness.
To the back there, please.
Can that be my question, or is it someone further back?
No, I think it's you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about, in the study, have you looked into the factors that lead people to find happiness in their life, apart from mental illness, prison, drug addiction, whatever? Have you looked at that?
Yes, we have. In fact, lovely. This is the last question. It's a lovely one to end on, because we're paid to find out all this awful stuff, right? And we as researchers ourselves get sick of. We get tired of always being at the end of the pool, which is the end that no one wants to be at. So we have done a number of studies about positive outcomes, happiness, or life satisfaction, or well-being, depending on your terminology. Some of them are actually covered in the book. It's probably camouflaged a bit in the book. We at one point thought of writing a book about positive outcomes per se. The irony of that is that we thought maybe our funder wouldn't like us doing this. Because we live hand to mouth. Funding rounds every 5 or 6 years in New Zealand. And people say to me all the time, well, the feeding study's too important, they're not funded. Well, it happened to me, and on my watch. And I had to beg, borrow, steal at Wellington for 3 months. I went through Whitehead to try and get interim funding for 1 more year, trying to have another go, but it was, I think it was successful. The sad thing about that, by the way, and I'll try and come back to your question more specifically, the sad thing about that is the New Zealand agency didn't back us with the same application in the US that was ranked in the top 5%. It was triaged out of New Zealand, and in other words, it was the worst third, deemed to be the worst third. And therein lies the lesson: never be too far ahead. Because that was when we were talking about biological aging and the process of aging as being fundamental to understanding all sorts of things. And people, I think, reviewed the application. Thought, these people aren't old yet. You can't study aging. People that are in their 30s, 40s. I mean, how dense. These are my peers. And so yes, there's work on life satisfaction. We've actually got something big planned this year. I want to take the Treasury model of well-being that they've used to inform the budget, and which is a theoretical model as opposed to an empirical model that's subjected to an empirical analysis using all the data we have across the life course of our studying to try and work out pathways to well-being, but also to reform government as to where their model may need a tweaking. And so I guess I'm doing that now without fear of what the funders will say, just because I'm getting old. And I don't do it anymore. Does that answer your question, Pat? No. So watch this space. What I've got to do is to lay the seeds of sustainability and ongoing.
Well, folks, I think we should draw it to a close. It's been a very special night, and I think we've all felt very privileged to be here. Richie?
Thanks, Steve.
You've been outstanding, as always. Have you got an comments to make? Do you want to put an advert in for the book? Or?
Well, if you haven't seen the exhibition, please have a good look around or bring your friends back before it finishes. It's, I can tell you it's incredibly authentic in so much as I was showing Ted. There's a box down there that has several artifacts, I think it was from the 80s decade, and there's a Paul Moore cigarette packet. Now, I was a student in the 80s, so yeah, and that's exactly what the Paul Moore cigarette packet looked like back then. I also happened to notice there was some feather-like condoms, and they're exactly like they were. Once I picked up from student health, they were all three of those days, you see.
On that note. Thank you.
He's a very busy guy, and he came all the way from Waihi today just to be here, to be supportive. So, thanks, mate. If anyone wants to buy a book, I strongly recommend you do. I'll be outside. I have to say that, you see, I'm not actually a very good salesman, but it's a very interesting read.